BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin.
Okay, hello everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? Just a couple of quick announcements and reminders before we truly begin. And the first is that I would like to give a big thank you to everyone who's been following the Anything Goes Friday segments. And the most recent one was about the Thuggee cult from India, perhaps the most murderous group of individuals ever. And also a big thank you to everyone who has been following the Wednesday show, which is about Jack the Ripper. It's called the Jack the Ripper Report. And a lot of good comments have been coming in, the creation of a lot of good discussions. And if you're curious about the Ripper case as well, I invite you to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. And of course, there is always the BlackBoxOnlineRadio membership, which is available at BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out here on Zodiac Monday. And of course there is the membership too, which gives you bonus features and extra content, and I'm already assembling some material for the first ever members only podcast, which will come out here on Black Box Online Radio, but it will be done in the form of a private YouTube video for the members. But please feel free to join the membership, and you can participate in that one as well. Now, to get to today's topic, I recently did some interviews with Jeremy Berthiaume, who's the author of the book So I See You Don't Paint Houses, and he talks a lot about Richard Gaikowski as a Zodiac killer suspect, as well as implicating Gaikowski at several other murders that are not extraordinarily discussed in the Zodiac world, but Gaikowski still is a major suspect in them. And also, there was a documentary that came out on Peacock called The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, which was about Thomas Henry Horton's theory that the Zodiac murders in 1968 and 69 were all a giant hoax, that someone was writing letters taking credit for murders that he didn't commit. Now, if you do watch this, it's available on Peacock in 2 episodes, but it also has a lot of material that has been left out. For example, they didn't talk at all about Thomas Horton's suspect, Hal Snook, whom he claims wrote the Zodiac Killer letters, but did not commit the murders. And I would like to respond to your questions and comments about the myth of the Zodiac Killer from this documentary. The first one comes to us from Daniel Webster, who says, I do think the Zodiac was a hoax. I think none of the fingerprints are the Zodiac. Now, a paramedic has stated that the bloody fingerprints were his. Don't know for sure, but I believe that the model glue to not leave fingerprints. I also believe that the Zodiac had access to police reports. I hear that the David and Betty Lou murder report and the Zodiac report was identical. Also, there was one thing that the police and they/Zodiac got wrong. They were both wrong on her clothing. I don't remember if she was wearing pants and they said a skirt or vice versa. What do you think? And yes, this is from Daniel Webster. Thank you for the comment. Okay, so about the fingerprints. It's my understanding that the fingerprints he's talking about came after the Stein murder, the Zodiac Killer's final confirmed crime, on October 11th of 1969, and it's my understanding that the paramedics had all provided their fingerprints for cross-testing so that they could be ruled out as the sources of the fingerprints. But the bloody fingerprint that had been left behind has recently been attributed to Lindsay Robbins, one of the witnesses in the Zodiac killer mystery, and one of the witnesses who provided the details for the Zodiac's composite sketch, the famous image of the Zodiac killer that we've been looking at for all these years, which I have to tell you over and over again is just a white male in a pair of glasses. But, I mean, yes, Lindsay Robbins has been the, one of the contributing sources for that. Rebecca Robbins was another. We just call them the Robbins kids. They actually saw the Zodiac killer leaving Paul Stein's taxi. And it's possible that Lindsay Robinson went over to lift up Paul Stein's body, and then he decided that he was unable to do so and decided to exit the taxi, and that after touching Paul Stein's bloody body, he left a fingerprint on the cab door, but I'm not 100% convinced that it actually was Lindsay Robbins' fingerprint. Now, the Zodiac killer stated in a letter that he didn't leave any fingerprints because he covered his fingertips with airplane cement. That's the model glue that Daniel's referring to. 2 coats of airplane cement on his fingertips would hide his fingerprints. And I'm going to test this out in the near future because I want to find out, is that true or not? Some people say it's true. Other people say it's false. And a lot of people simply point to the fact that, okay, this guy was really afraid that he left fingerprints behind, so he just made up a wild story that wasn't true. Yeah, you have my fingerprints, but those aren't mine. Yeah, because I put glue on my tips. But as far as the airplane cement go, I still get comments to this day when people are like, oh, my suspect was a pilot, therefore he was the Zodiac, because the Zodiac said he used airplane cement. But I have since learned that airplane cement refers to the glue from model airplanes. That's why Daniel's calling it model glue, because it's like for toys as opposed to actual airplanes. And I tend to believe that. I mean, that would definitely be easily available. But here's another part of Daniel Webster's comment. I hear that the Betty Lou murder report and the Zodiac report were identical. Yes, mostly. The girl had her feet to the west, the boy had his feet to the car, the number of shots fired. I mean, all of those points do line up. But the next point, though, is something we can challenge. The Zodiac and the police were both wrong on her clothing. That does not refer to Betty Lou Jensen, the victim from the Lake Herman Road murders. That refers to Darlene Ferrer, the victim from the Zodiac's second crime, the Blue Rock Springs shooting. And it says they were both wrong on her clothing. This is one of Thomas Horan's strongest points that is not mentioned in the documentary at all, and I was shocked about this with the myth of the Zodiac killer because it is indeed a strong point. Darlene Ferrin was the third victim of the Zodiac killer, killed in the second crime. The first were David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, and then Darlene Ferrin was murdered. And she was murdered in a slack dress, which is a one-piece jumpsuit that had pant legs, but it's called a slack dress. And in Horan's theory, someone read the police reports and decided to write letters taking credit for murders that he didn't commit. And what he thinks is that somebody read the police reports and they saw a slack dress and they didn't know what that was, so they wrote that the girl was wearing patterned slacks. In the Zodiac killer's first letter, he said that I am the murderer of the 2 teenagers at Lake Herman last Christmas and the girl on the 4th of July. To prove that I killed them, I will state some facts that only I and the police know. And as I said, he said some things about David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. The girl had her feet to the west, the boy had his feet to the car, but the girl was wearing patterned slacks. And no matter what anyone says about Thomas Henry Horan and this Zodiac hoax theory, the idea that these weren't the actions of a single serial killer, but rather someone has taken unrelated murders and written letters taking credit for them, I think that's a reasonable observation. The idea that someone didn't know what a slack dress was. I had never heard of a slack dress before the Zodiac killer mystery, and also I wasn't alive in 1969, so I was just unfamiliar with what women were wearing at the time. Absolutely. I can understand the thought process. Someone interpreted it as dress slacks. And there was a photo of Darlene Ferrin's patterned slack dress in the police files. And you can see how his theory starts to come together. But the problem with the Zodiac hoax theory is that it just keeps compounding and growing bigger and bigger, and there are just more and more levels to it, more and more layers to it, and it gets a little bit wild and a little bit far out. But as far as the thing, I don't remember if she was wearing pants and they said it was a skirt or vice versa. Well, she was wearing a jumpsuit that had pant legs, but it was called a slack dress. What do you think? I mean, my honest answer is I don't know, but the more time I spend looking at the Zodiac Killer mystery, I tend to lean toward a single perpetrator committing the crimes. For the longest time, I highly entertained the possibility that there was someone reading the police reports and taking credit for murders that he didn't commit for the first two crimes. Absolutely, I didn't see much of a hoax theory for the Zodiac Killer's third and fourth crimes, the Lake Berryessa stabbing, and the murder of Paul Stein, the taxi driver. But with the first two crimes, the Lake Herman Road murders and the Blue Rock Springs shooting which saw the death of Darlene Ferrin, yes, I thought that they could be drug-related or gang-related shootings. Now, there are simple explanations. Maybe the Zodiac just looked into the car, saw the pant legs of her jumpsuit, and thought she was wearing patterned slacks. I mean, that's the simplest one. And also, by the way, some people have noticed that I have been reading off comments using their YouTube account name as opposed to the display name that they have chosen for their, YouTube and Google accounts. And the reason is that for some reason on all of my feeds, I'm only getting the direct account name. So it might sound a little bit different to some people, but some of you I will definitely recognize. And one of them is Manny Grossman using his Undercurrents page. And Manny Grossman has followed the Son of Sam case very closely, and he wrote into the channel sharing his response to the documentary that was made about the myth of the Zodiac Killer and Thomas Henry Horan. And Manny Grossman says, Horan is now going around like Al Bundy, reliving his high school football days. Now, firstly, Al Bundy was a record setter. We have to give him credit for that. I mean, he scored 4 touchdowns in one game. Polk High School. Okay, he can have his moment in the sun. Secondarily, sometimes Manny and the professor are on good terms, and sometimes they are not. Most of the time, they are not. But for Manny Grossman, he should recognize that Thomas Henry Horan was and is his biggest fan. He used Manny's name in the title of every single YouTube video that he did for 2 years. Más o menos. But Manny Grossman's comment continues by saying, he's thanking people as if he won an Oscar. Meanwhile, zero self-awareness that he was used by Knock as a clown in the production. Knock is the name of the filmmaker who was behind the Myth of the Zodiac Killer documentary on Peacock. Knock literally found the most batshit crazy person he could. Luckily, the drunken and deeply disturbed professor fit the bill. LOL, now I have an archive of bad reviews I can go to if I ever feel down. Well, I think you can get the tone of that comment there. Now, as far as why the Myth of the Zodiac Killer was chosen for a documentary on Peacock, the filmmaker stated very clearly that he found Thomas Henry Horan's theory to be compelling, unless maybe Manny knows something to the contrary. As I said, he has run a YouTube channel that was much bigger than this one, so he's probably somewhat connected to the true crime world. But as far as finding the most batshit crazy person he could, I was expecting that the documentary would have a lot more challenges or explanations, or in the concept of a documentary, not only be about presenting somebody's true crime theory. Maybe if you're producing it yourself, be like, okay, here's what I think. But you would expect that a documentary would be about getting the truth. All right, why don't you put up not only people who are giving comments, like they had Michael Butterfield being the counterbalance figure in the myth of the Zodiac Killer. Well, why not actually go through the forensics and try to find out, is this true or not? Was this factual? Did the Zodiac crimes actually happen the way that Thomas Henry Horne said? And there are all sorts of ways that they can do this. They can also get professionals. They can get people who are going to actually try and recreate the crime scenes the way that Thomas Henry Horne claims they happened, and find out, are his conclusions tenable, or are they ridiculous, or are they somewhere in the middle? And a lot of the Myth of the Zodiac Killer documentary was devoted to linguistics analysis, and I didn't find that to be the most valuable because they left it very, very open-ended. But moving on from that one, I do have to give a shout out to Tyler Grover, who left one particular comment about the Myth of the Zodiac Killer documentary, and that relates to the shell casing at Lake Herman Road. I said that a very strong point that was made in the documentary was Thomas Henry Horne's analysis of the Lake Herman Road murders, where he was talking about how a shell casing was found in a particular location, and that it suggests that somebody got out of the passenger side of someone's car, meaning that there were two participants at Lake Herman Road, definitely going against the single killer theory that someone was driving the car and the shooter got out of the passenger side and fired a shot, and the shell casing was in a very particular area. And when you look at it in the documentary, it makes sense, but Tyler Grover's comment is, the spent shell could have gotten away from the other shells a million different ways before a second shooter has to be added. It could have bounced off the hood of the car, got kicked, struck, in somebody's clothing for a moment. I assume that the assault was chaotic. Warren is very unconvincing, and his theory is all over the place. Seems like he changes it weekly. Well, there definitely are elements of the hoax theory that are changed, but as far as the spent shell casing, yes, Tyler does raise strong points. And, this is not unheard of in the true crime world. And I think that I do have to side with Tyler on this one, and that is that it is possible that the shell casing could have been moved in some way, not even done in a deliberate way, because in other true crime cases we encounter this. One of the biggest pieces of evidence in the Kurt Cobain murder theory is that Kurt Cobain, the frontman for Nirvana, committed suicide. Or did he? Well, some people believe that he was murdered because of the position of a shell casing, and then the people who think that he committed suicide just simply point out, well, it could have bounced off of a different object, or it possibly could have even bounced off his leg. And Tyler said something very similar in this comment about the Zodiac hoax theory, that it could have been bouncing off of a car hood, or perhaps it was stuck in someone's clothing for a moment while they were moving around, and then it fell down. There are possibilities. So it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody exited the passenger side of a car the way that Thomas Horne said. And I do have to give credit to Thomas Horne because he is somewhat of an engaging presenter, and he sounds very passionate about his theory. And when he's presenting it in the documentary, yeah, it makes sense. I could follow what he was saying, and I think a lot of it relates to his broadcasting style as well as his media presence that he has created over the past several years. But when we actually look at the possibilities, I think Tyler makes a convincing case that there could be pieces of information that have been overlooked. And now I would like to switch gears and talk about a different episode that I did on Black Box Online Radio, and it was one of the interviews that I've done with Jeremy Berthume, and it's called Possible Zodiac Killer Crimes, the one that came out last week. Now, there are two things that I will discuss with this comment here, and one of them is Lawrence Kane as a Zodiac Killer suspect, and also as we have discussed, maybe Lawrence Kane was involved with some of the possible Zodiac crimes, but he wasn't actually involved with the Zodiac murders themselves, particularly the disappearance of Donna Lass. And secondly, in the interviews that I've done with Jeremy Berthume, who's the author of the book So I See You Don't Paint Houses, he believes that the first Zodiac killer victim was named Thomas Snow, and he was murdered in 1965 by Richard Gaikowski, and yes, he thinks that Richard Gaikowski was the Zodiac killer. This comment comes to us from Sandy Betts, who says, I know for a fact that Larry Kane was working a couple doors down from Donna Lass's nursing station in the Sahara Tahoe Hotel and Casino when she went missing. I went to the 50th anniversary for the employees from that casino. I spoke to people who knew Donna Lass and Lawrence Kane, including the mayor. Harvey Hines, that's the guy who brought Lawrence Kane forward as the Zodiac suspect, spoke to others who worked with Donna, and they said that yes, Kane did try to go out with him, did try to get Donna to go out with him, and she didn't like him. As far as the money being given to Harvey, I'm going to stop right there for a second because I wanted to respond to this Lawrence Kane part first. Now, numerous people have talked about, at some point in his life, Lawrence Kane worked at the Sahara Tahoe Hotel and Casino, where possible Zodiac killer victim Donna Lass was. But were they actually there at the same time? And, I mean, Lawrence Kane should have been working a few doors down because he worked in the real estate office, and Donna Lass worked at the nurse's station. And Sandy Betts says she's talked to people who have confirmed that. And, I mean, this is not certifiable. I mean, I can't bring this in as a form of documentation to prove it to anyone, but I am going to take Sandy's word for it if she says she's gone and met people from the Sahara Tahoe who worked there and say, yes, Donna Lass and Lawrence Kane knew each other. And Jeremy Berthium has talked about this in his book, So I See You Don't Paint Houses, that he thinks that Richard Gaikowski was the Zodiac killer, but that Lawrence Kane should be the prime suspect for the attempted abduction of Kathleen Johns, as well as the possible abduction and murder of Donna Lass. Donna Lass's remains have never been found, so she is still a missing person to this day. But that's a very different type of theory, because that would mean that Lawrence Kane is a suspect only in the unconfirmed Zodiac crimes, and I can follow, though, what Jeremy says about how, okay, Donna Lass was abducted on September 6th of 1970, but Kathleen Johns was abducted on March 22nd of 1970, months prior. I mean, we're talking about almost 6 months prior, or thereabouts, and it's really about, I mean, 5.5, 5.75. Okay, I'll move on from that. Okay, so Lawrence Kane tries to abduct Kathleen Johns, and then Kathleen Johns is taken to a police station after she gets away from the abductor, and she sees a Zodiac poster on the wall and said, that's the man who tried to abduct me. And then Lawrence Kane starts thinking that, okay, I resemble this Zodiac killer guy, I guess I kind of look like him. So then he commits the murder of Donna Lass, and then sends the Donna Lass postcard a year after the Kathleen Johns abduction, and he's like, alright, well, I can commit crimes and blame them on the Zodiac, even though perhaps he's not committing that many. But Jeremy is also of the belief that many people are, and that is that Lawrence Kane was a serial killer. He was not convicted as a serial killer. If you were to Google him, you'll find that he's a Zodiac killer suspect, but he's of the mind that Lawrence Kane did commit multiple murders over time with cooling off periods. He accuses him of the murder of Donna Lass, for example, as well as the 1974 murder of Dana Lull. And most people accept that Lawrence Kane is the prime suspect in the murder of Dana Lull, although that case is still unsolved and the perpetrator has never been apprehended. So with the Zodiac killer mystery, we see very clearly that there could be serial killers who simply did not get caught, and there could be a combination of serial killers involved. And the same could be said of Zodiac suspect Richard Gaikowski. I mean, firstly, some people think he was the Zodiac, and then some people think that even if he wasn't connected to the Zodiac killer mystery, he might have actually committed other murders out there, and he's also doing it in a very confusing way on purpose to avoid getting caught. But I actually want to move on to the next part of Sandy Betts' comment, and there are some points here about the murder of Thomas Snow from 1965. Thomas Snow was a restaurant owner. He owned a restaurant called the Casa Orinda in Orinda, California, and he was found shot with a .38 caliber pistol. And Sandy Betts' comment says that I am also related to the victim Thomas Snow by marriage. One of his daughters went to high school with me. His other two daughters went to school in Orinda. They were my cousins by marriage. Zodiac wrote that he shot a man with a .38 in a car. Thomas Snow was shot with a .38 in his car. There was a lot of gambling at Snow's well-known restaurant, the Casa Orinda,
We think someone owed Thomas Snow money and didn't want to pay him back, and that was why he was shot. And I wanted to read this comment for a very specific reason, because Sandy Bess appears to be sharing an alternative to the theory that was put forward by Jeremy Berthiaume, and that is that, well, that it wasn't Richard Gaikowski, it was just somebody that owed money to Thomas Snow. And, I mean, as I understand, she would have a first-hand connection to the family, and this is something that people would have discussed. But Thomas Snow was in his 50s when he was shot, definitely older than some of the Zodiac killer victims, and I mentioned that in my interview with Jeremy. But also, he put forward the theory that Richard Gaikowski had an obsession with Darlene Ferrin, and he tried to get Darlene Ferrin a job at a restaurant in Orinda, California, and that turned out to be unsuccessful. So some way, somehow, there's some type of exchange of words and actions, and that ended up with Richard Gaikowski shooting Thomas Snow. Okay, that's one possibility. And the other possibility would be that, well, Thomas Snow was involved in some type of illegal gambling ring, and he didn't owe money to somebody. Somebody actually owed money to him, and that was their way out. There could be different possibilities in play here, and it's not going to come down to only one option. And I would like to ask you guys something. Which one makes more sense to you? And I know that some of you follow these episodes weekly, so you've definitely heard my presentation on the murder of Thomas Snow, as well as the interviews that I've done with Jeremy Berthiaume, author of So I See You Don't Paint Houses, and he talks a lot about the murder of Thomas Snow. And he knows so much more about the case than I do, and he even put forward the theory that at the Casa Orinda, they had various cattle brands that were on the wall, and these symbols are somewhat similar to the Zodiac Killer ciphers, and the creation of the Zodiac Killer ciphers, allegedly by Richard Gaikowski, could have come from the cattle brand symbols that were on the wall at the Casa Orinda. Which one makes sense to you? I would love to know what you guys think about that particular comment. And the next comment comes to us from Ray Penrod, who is talking about his Zodiac suspect, Richard Ralph Mangan. And he was born Richard Mangan, changed his name to Ralph Mangan. And Ray Penrod says, put a picture of the Zodiac Killer composite sketch next to a picture of Ralph Mangan from the early 90s sitting in front of two flags, and look at the similarities. And I absolutely will give credit to Ray on this point. Even though I don't think that Ralph Mangan was the Zodiac Killer, and I've talked about this in a previous episode, that there are even some certain details with Ray's account of the events matching up with some other things I found online that don't appear to be consistent, but I do think that Ralph Mangan has a certain similarity to the Zodiac, particularly in the forehead shape and the jawline. Now, people always overlook this detail, and they propose suspects like the previously mentioned Richard Gaikowski and Lawrence Kane, who have very square faces, very rectangular faces, almost like blockheads, to use my Charlie Brown language. But as far as somebody like Richard Ralph Mangan, he definitely looks like the Zodiac, even though he's much older in this photo, and as previously stated, it was from the early 90s. But I just want to give credit where credit is due. Now, Ray's theory involves a Zodiac D.B. Cooper connection, and the man sitting in front of the flags was not only the Zodiac Killer, but then went on to become D.B. Cooper. And Ray learned about this because he was the cellmate of Richard Ralph Mangan in prison, and that's pretty much all I know about this story, because Ray is working on a book, and he hasn't shared all of his findings publicly, so I can't comment on them, simply because I don't know yet what he is going to say. However, I do think that there are certain similarities between Ralph Mangan and the Zodiac composite sketch, and people often overlook the chin as well, how the Zodiac Killer's chin forms into a very unique and distinct shape. Now, it's possible that the composite sketch is not perfect. Lindsay Robbins, the witness who helped contribute to the composite sketch, stated that it was very accurate. And this is coming from somebody who actually saw the Zodiac Killer, but there's always the possibility that people could be mistaken, and it definitely is not a perfect science. But right now I would like to take the show in more of the direction of true crime talk radio.
Last week on the Anything Goes Friday segment, I was talking about the Thuggee cult from India, which one of the members of the Thuggee cult was named Thug Baram, and it's possible that he was the most prolific serial killer in history, murdering 931 people, but it's also possible that he didn't actually commit 931 murders. He was either present as a witness or maybe even a participant in some way in the murders, but he didn't actually commit them himself, and I even propose that the term serial killer might not be fitting for him because, as I said, he was part of a cult that was also involved in banditry and thievery. So that kind of challenges the definition of a serial killer. But in that episode, I was interweaving a bunch of different stories together and looking at how they all seem to connect. And I'm going to do that with the Zodiac Killer mystery, but I also want to look at one of the recent news stories, and that is related to the capture of the Gilgo Beach killer, who has been identified as Rex Hoyerman. And, I mean, we aren't completely certain if he committed all of the murders in the Long Island serial killer saga. The Gilgo Four were the final victims of the Long Island serial killer, and it's possible that the Long Island serial killer had a fifth victim in that circle named Shannon Gilbert. During the early years, the victims were mutilated, and later on, the mutilations and dismembering of the victims stopped. But we have another comment from Manny Grossman who says, the Long Island serial killer and the son of Sam share one huge connection. Both cases have been sensationalized to the point of absurdity. With the son of Sam, it was Maury Terry's complete horse shit that many glommed onto. Grifters abounded in the son of Sam for years, and for the Long Island serial killer, there were no shortages of conspiracy theories and assorted grifters either. And look what happened in the end. Both stories ended up with fairly mundane endings. Sad and pathetic guys taking out their frustrations on innocent victims. Nothing more, nothing less. Hopefully the true crime world wakes up and realizes it's a brand new day. My video series totally destroyed Maury's cult myth, and the cops are now dismantling the last remaining Long Island serial killer grifters. Maybe it's time to start treating true crime with the seriousness it deserves, and not concocting maniacal fantasies like some current podcasters, not you, Ned, continue to do. I'm thinking of a certain drunken loser who tells his 4 fans that my father was the head of Operation Mockingbird. Okay, I mean, Manny, definitely thank you for the comment. And yes, he was very clear he's not referring to me as one of these people who was trying to concoct weird theories about the Long Island serial killer mystery. Mostly during my episodes on the list, I was just telling the stories of the victims. And of course, there's a little bit of commentary in there, but I was really just trying to make it, very respectful to the victims, and John Lorden, the host of the channel Brain Scratch, or the host of the show Brain Scratch on the Lorden Arts channel, said, when it comes to a serial killer case, it's very difficult to talk about it in one episode because it doesn't do justice to the victims, and I experienced that firsthand with the Long Island serial killer mystery. And Manny points out that there were these conspiracy theories with the Lisk case. Okay, absolutely. Mostly that it was a sex ring or there's some type of snuff film ring that is being run by the New York elites, and that they were just using the Long Island serial killer as an enforcer who was cutting up and dismembering the bodies. And even I thought about that at a certain point because, I mean, it just seemed like it was happening in a very affluent area of Long Island, or at the very least, the victims had some connections to that area. The bodies were actually found on a secluded area of Gilgo Beach, and there's also a connection to Oak Beach, but I digress from that. And the whole point is that these theories are very wild, and they're very far out, and they get your attention. But as far as this, in terms of substance, it comes back to something that I've shared time and time again on the channel, and that is that conspiracy theories use real facts, but sometimes they have fictitious connections among the facts. And, I mean, I think almost everyone can admit that. Sometimes conspiracy theories have a lot of substance. Sometimes they're even halfway true, and rarely, but sometimes as well, conspiracy theories can be true. That there can be some type of deep malicious plot that has been launched, and that people thwarted it because it was immoral and inhumane, or sometimes with the actions of the CIA. they do horrible things, like trying to poison milk trucks in Cuba and then some form of twisted, conspiratorial terroristic act. Okay, like, I mean, there are terrible things that happen in the world, and sometimes there are people that are hiding the truth for a malicious reason. It's a mix. It's a mixed bag of things. And most people are aware of that. Most level-headed people are aware of that. As far as just instantly making connections to other people, I believe he's referring to Thomas Henry Horn by saying, I'm thinking of a certain drunken loser who tells his 4 fans that my father was the head of Operation Mockingbird. Thomas Henry Horn released a video recently talking about how there is a link between the Long Island serial killer and JonBenet Ramsey. I haven't watched that video yet, so I can't comment on the specifics, but I think you can see the idea of where this is going. Now, with the Zodiac Killer mystery, yes, these types of conspiracy theories happen all the time. Some people to this day believe that the Zodiac Killer was a fictitious creation, not by Robert Graysmith, like Thomas Horn claimed in the early parts of his Zodiac Killer theory, but instead by the CIA. And it goes so far beyond Horn's book because they're talking about how the Zodiac was created by the CIA to affect modern culture, to try and destroy the image of peace, love, and joy created by the hippies. And I mean, there are just countless theories that involve the Zodiac in some type of either government-related conspiracy, CIA conspiracy, or how about the ones that involve some type of group that is not connected to the government, like the Zodiac theories involving Troy Houghton as one of the Minutemen, and he's connected to a different organization. Even Paul Doerr has a Minuteman connection, and there are these just attempts to bring the Zodiac to a different movement. And I say movement because it doesn't only have to be an organized political group. You could even have an example is the Zodiac was trying to become a budding white supremacist serial killer. That would be another theory that has been shared by Sam Fisher in his 2 books where he talks about Joseph Paul Franklin as a Zodiac killer suspect. And I'm not saying that any of these people are wrong because it's an unsolved case. I'm just trying to use Black Box Online Radio as a channel that can organize some of these different true crime theories. Now, Manny Grossman left a comment on a Son of Sam video that I did on this channel once, and he said something to the effect of that, do you realize who you're talking to? I did a very deep dive in the Son of Sam case, presenting himself as an authority figure. And somebody called him out on that, saying that that was a very egotistical thing to say. Now, as far as a stance on that, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, what Manny said, because I wouldn't be bothered if Miriam C. Davis did that, who's the author of the definitive authority on the Axeman of New Orleans case. And I've corresponded with Miriam C. Davis, and if she were to say that, I'd be like, well, she is a very strong authority on the subject. She has a very high understanding of the subject. Now, if Robert Graysmith did that about the Zodiac Killer mystery, I would laugh in his face and I would rip him a new one, because this is something that people have trouble accepting, and that is that Robert Graysmith is the author of Zodiac, definitely the most famous book about the Zodiac Killer mystery, which claimed to have been based on the Zodiac Killer police reports, but in reality, it was what Henry Kissinger would call a pack of slimy lies, and he didn't actually say that. He just uses that expression from time to time. You get the idea. But yes, it's just a bunch of half-truths. And then Graysmith used the Zodiac Killer case to springboard his writing career, evolving from being just the cartoonist and production assistant at the San Francisco Chronicle to becoming somebody who would follow all types of true crime cases and just blending in stories. Like, everything he says is just half truth and half fiction. And it's widely accepted, though, but one of the points that always comes up is people just appreciate how he shared the Zodiac Killer mystery to a very wide audience. One person who does not appreciate that is me, though, because he didn't tell the truth. And he does it over and over again. And there are a lot of people who just simply don't want to accept that their hero was somebody who did not always tell the truth. And the example that I always go back to is it's almost like Okay, you got your grandfather, maybe even your great-grandfather, who always told these old war stories about how, all the things that he did back in the days of the war. And then once you became an adult, you found out half of them were false. Oh, some of them were true. Absolutely. Some of them were true, but half of them were false. And you're kind of left in this in-between mode where, did this person deserve respect? Halfway, I suppose. I mean, for the good parts, yes, and for the bad parts, probably not. So that's where I stand on Robert Graysmith. Any type of factual analysis that he did, as well as his own theorizing, I can't tell what was in anyone else's mind other than my own. But if he actually did an honest job with his theorizing, then I would commend him for that. But if he even made those parts up, then it's just a pack of slimy lies all the same. But where do you stand on Robert Graysmith? What do you think about anything that he has shared? And what do you think about the current state of true crime broadcasters and conspiracy theorists on YouTube? Feel free to respond to those comments made by Manny Grossman, and you can also respond to anything about the Myth of the Zodiac Killer documentary, and even the forensics issue that we brought up about the shell casings at Lake Herman Road. And if you also want to look at the similarities between the Zodiac and some other true crime cases that I was talking about, the Son of Sam, the Long Island serial killer. But I will leave you with one final note on the Son of Sam, which relates to something that Manny Grossman was just sharing, and that is that David Berkowitz was the Son of Sam shooter, but he was just an ordinary, bland, unimportant individual. And the only reason people talk about him is because he chose to commit murders, is because he became a murderer. He was a mundane person, as using Manny's word, and he chose to commit murders. He was an underperformer in life. He was someone who didn't have a lot going for him, and there's absolutely nothing interesting at all about David Berkowitz other than he took something into a dark side. He even had to make up a fictitious story about how he was interacting with a dog that had a demon inside of him. Well, the real David Berkowitz was just an absolute nobody. So then he had to almost export his self-worth into that fictitious story. And with the Zodiac Killer, he had to export his self-worth into the persona that wasn't even his own name. And he had to create this image because he was probably a really boring individual himself. So what do you think about all of that? Feel free to respond in the comments down below, and that's all for me now. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, and I will see you over on Instagram. Goodbye.